Welcome. You have made it here to this quiet hour. Let the noise of the day settle behind you. Tonight we are going to follow a story that history does not often record. It is not about battles won or lost. It is not about kings or the grand movements of armies across maps. It is about something smaller, quieter, and far more constant. We are going to explore how medieval soldiers survived the winter night when they could not light a fire. For much of history, armies moved in spring and summer. Those were the seasons when roads were passable, when horses could find forage, when the ground was firm enough to march on. But strategy did not always wait for good weather. Sieges stretched into the cold months. Raids were launched across frozen ground, and when soldiers were forced to camp in winter, they faced an adversary as relentless as any enemy, the cold itself. In many of these camps, fire was forbidden. A single flame could be seen for miles across a snowy plain. Smoke carried on. The wind. Light betrayed position. So soldiers slept in darkness, relying on wool, on the earth beneath them, on the warmth of the bodies beside them. This is their story. Let it unfold slowly. There is no rush. History tends to remember the visible moments, the charge across the field, the siege tower against the wall, the treaty signed in a stone hall. These are the events that leave records, that find their way into chronicles and onto maps. But beneath those moments lies another history. It is quieter. It does not appear in the accounts of nobles or the reports of generals. It is the history of the soldier who woke each morning, cold and stiff, and somehow survived another night. Medieval warfare was not a continuous sequence of battles. Most of a soldier's time was spent waiting for orders, waiting for supplies, waiting for the weather to change. And in winter, waiting through the long, dark hours when the cold pressed in from all sides, the environment during these months was not a backdrop. It was an active force. It dictated what was possible. It determined whether an army could advance, whether a siege could continue, whether men would live or die before they ever saw combat. For a soldier in a winter camp, survival was a technical problem. It required understanding how heat moved through the world, how the body lost warmth, how materials could trap air, how the ground could drain heat, how proximity to other bodies could mean the difference between sleep and death. This was not knowledge written in manuals. It was passed from one campaign to the next, learned through trial, through error, through the long nights when someone did not wake up. The medieval military world had a phrase for the coldest part of the night. They called it the hour when death walks closest. It was the time just before dawn, when the fire had burned down to nothing, when the body's reserves were at their lowest, when even the act of breathing felt like effort. To survive that hour required preparation. It required discipline. It required a form of engineering that had nothing to do with stone or wood, and everything to do with wool, with straw, with the careful arrangement of human bodies in the dark. The soldiers who endured these nights were not extraordinary. They were ordinary men, conscripted or contracted, who found themselves far from home in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. What they learned because they had to. And what they learned was this: survival was not about strength. It was about routine. It was about understanding that warmth was something you built, piece by piece, layer by layer, through methods so simple they seem almost obvious now. But in the cold, in the dark, with the wind cutting through the gaps in a tent, nothing was obvious. Everything had to be learned. This is the history beneath the spectacle. The history of how men slept when they could not light a fire. The history of the small acts that allowed them to wake again. War had a season. For most of the medieval period, that season was summer. Armies moved when the roads were dry, when rivers were low enough to ford, when horses could graze on fresh grass and soldiers could forage from the land they passed through. Spring through early autumn was the time for campaigns, for sieges, for the movement of large forces across open country. Winter was different. The ground froze. Mud turned to ice, then to impassable slush when it thawed. Rivers swelled with snowmelt or locked under ice too thin to cross safely. Forage disappeared. Horses weakened. Supply lines stretched and snapped. For these reasons, most armies withdrew to winter quarters. They billeted in towns, fortified strongholds, or returned home entirely. The campaign season ended. The fighting paused, but not always. There were times when strategic necessity overruled the logic of seasons. A siege that had begun in summer could not simply be abandoned when the first snow fell. To lift a siege was to waste months of effort, to give the enemy time to resupply, to lose the momentum that had brought the army to the walls in the first place. So the siege continued, and the soldiers who surrounded the fortress found themselves digging in for a winter they had not planned for. In other cases, winter was not an obstacle, but an opportunity. In the Baltic region, the Teutonic Knights developed a specialised form of winter warfare. They called it the Winter Reise, the winter journey. It took advantage of the fact that the marshes and rivers that made the region nearly impassable in summer became highways when they froze. The knights moved across the ice with supply trains, striking at Lithuanian and Prussian settlements that were otherwise unreachable. The cold was not their enemy, it was their ally. It allowed them to go where their enemies did not expect them. For these campaigns, the ability to survive a winter night without fire was not optional. It was fundamental. In England, the Viking great army that arrived in the 9th century did not retreat when winter came. Instead, they established fortified encampments at sites like Torksey and Repton. These were not temporary bivouacs. They were functioning settlements, occupied by thousands of people for months at a time. Archaeological evidence shows that these winter camps were highly organised. There were workshops for repairing weapons and equipment. There were merchants. There were craft workers. The Vikings did not simply endure winter. They used it as a time to consolidate, to prepare, to strengthen their position for the next season's campaigns. This practice, known as overwintering, required a sophisticated understanding of logistics. Food had to be stockpiled, shelters had to be built or commandeered, fuel for fires had to be gathered and rationed, and above all, the army had to remain healthy enough to fight when spring returned. The decision to winter in the field was never taken lightly. It carried enormous risks. Disease spread more easily in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Frostbite and exposure could cripple a fighting force as effectively as any battle. Morale suffered in the long, dark months, but the alternative, abandoning a strategic position or losing the element of surprise, was often worse. So soldiers prepared. They adapted. They learned to survive conditions that pushed the limits of what the human body could endure. And the first thing they had to learn was the nature of the cold itself. Cold is not a single condition. It has gradations, each with its own dangers. In the medieval period, soldiers did not have thermometers. They could not measure temperature in precise degrees, but they understood through experience that different kinds of cold required different responses. There was wet cold. This was the cold of rain and sleet, of melting snow, of damp ground that soaked through boots and clothing. Wet cold was dangerous because it destroyed insulation. Wool, the primary material used for winter clothing, could absorb moisture and still retain some of its warming properties. But when it became fully saturated, it lost much of its effectiveness. Heat drained away through conduction, through direct contact with the wet fabric. Leather footwear was even worse. Once soaked, it stayed wet. It chafed. It froze stiff overnight. A soldier with wet feet faced not just discomfort, but the real risk of frostbite. Wet cold typically occurred at temperatures just above or below freezing. It was the cold of early winter or late winter thaws, when the air hovered around the point where water turned to ice and back again. This was the cold that sapped strength, that made every step an effort, that left men shivering uncontrollably by nightfall. Then there was dry cold. This was the cold of clear skies and frozen ground. The air was crisp. Snow, when it fell, was light and powdery. Clothing stayed dry. Wool retained its loft, the air pockets between its fibres that provided insulation. Dry cold was easier to manage in some ways. A soldier could keep moving without the drag of waterlogged gear, but it brought its own challenges. Wind cut through any gap in clothing. Exposed skin froze quickly. Metal tools and weapons became painful to touch with bare hands. And then there was the deep cold. The cold that came in the heart of winter, when temperatures dropped far below freezing and stayed there for days or weeks. In this cold, the world became brittle, wood cracked, leather hardened, grease and oil thickened or froze entirely, making equipment difficult to use. For soldiers, the deep cold was a test of preparation. If they had not gathered enough fuel, if they had not secured adequate shelter, if they had not stockpiled enough food, they would not survive. The human body generates heat through metabolism. At rest, it produces roughly the same amount of heat as a small lamp. This heat must be retained. If it escapes faster than it is produced, the body's core temperature begins to drop. The body tries to compensate. Blood vessels near the skin constrict, reducing heat loss. Shivering begins, the involuntary muscle activity that generates additional warmth. But shivering is costly. It burns through the body's energy reserves. A soldier who shivered all night would wake exhausted, his strength depleted before the day even began. If core temperature continued to fall, the body's systems began to fail. Thinking became sluggish. Movement became uncoordinated. Eventually consciousness faded. Medieval soldiers may not have understood the physiology in modern terms, but they understood the progression. They knew that once a man started to lose his awareness, he was unlikely to recover without intervention. So the goal was simple: prevent heat loss, maintain the body's internal temperature. Do this through the night, every night, for as long as the campaign lasted. This required more than endurance, it required engineering. The location of a winter camp was not arbitrary. It was a calculated decision that could mean the difference between a defensible position and a death trap. The first consideration was defense. A camp needed to be difficult for an enemy to approach without being detected. Natural barriers were ideal. Rivers provided one form of protection, especially if they were wide or fast-flowing. Even in winter, a partially frozen river could slow an attacking force, giving defenders time to respond. Marshes offered similar advantages. In summer, they were nearly impassable. In winter, they became treacherous in a different way. Ice formed unevenly, creating patches of solid ground interspersed with areas where the surface could give way without warning. An enemy force attempting to cross a frozen marsh moved slowly, cautiously, and could be seen from a distance. High ground was another priority. A camp on elevated terrain had better visibility. Scouts could see approaching forces earlier, and elevation improved drainage, a critical factor in winter when melting snow or rain could turn low-lying areas into cold, muddy pits. Drainage mattered for more than just comfort. Standing water froze at night. A camp built on poorly drained ground became a lattice of ice by morning, making movement difficult and increasing the risk of injury. Worse, damp ground conducted heat away from anyone sleeping on it, even through layers of insulation. The Vikings understood this. At Torksey, they established their winter camp on a naturally elevated area near the River Trent. The site was protected on multiple sides by the river and surrounding marshland. It was large enough to house thousands of people, and it was positioned to allow for efficient drainage of snowmelt and rainwater. Archaeological excavations at Torksey have revealed the scale of the encampment. It covered roughly 26 hectares. Within that area, there were not just soldiers, but an entire community. Craft workers repaired weapons and tools, merchants traded goods, families lived alongside warriors. This was not a temporary bivouac. It was a winter settlement designed to sustain a large population through months of cold weather. The Teutonic Knights, operating in the forests and marshes of the Baltic, made similar calculations. Their winter camps were often established near rivers that had frozen solid enough to support supply sleds. They chose locations where timber was abundant, both for building shelters and for fuel, and they positioned themselves in areas where they could move quickly onto the ice roads that formed in the coldest months. But even with an ideal location, the camp itself had to be organised. Tents and shelters were not simply scattered across the ground. They were arranged to minimise exposure to wind. In some cases, soldiers dug shallow earthworks or built low walls of snow to create windbreaks. These windbreaks were simple structures, but they were effective. By blocking the wind, they reduced the rate at which heat was stripped away from tents and from the bodies of anyone moving through the camp. The choice of firewood sources also influenced camp location. Hardwoods like oak and beech were preferred for cooking and heating. They burned longer and produced less smoke than softwoods. A camp near a forest of hardwoods had a significant advantage, but in some campaigns, especially those in hostile territory, Gathering firewood was dangerous. Foraging parties could be ambushed. The noise of chopping wood could alert enemy scouts. In these situations, the camp had to rely on whatever fuel had been brought with the army or scavenged from abandoned structures nearby. When fire was restricted entirely, when the camp operated under cold camp protocol, the location mattered even more. Without fire, soldiers depended entirely on shelter and insulation. A camp in a windswept plain was far more dangerous than one in a sheltered valley or among trees that blocked the wind. Every decision about where to place the camp, how to orient it, how to arrange the shelters within it, was part of a larger system. A system designed to keep men alive through the winter night. And once the location was chosen, the next question was how to manage the one resource that could both save and betray them: fire. In the winter camp, one figure held authority that often transcended rank. The firemaster was responsible for every flame in the encampment. His decisions governed when fires could be lit, what fuel could be burned, and when fires had to be extinguished. This was not a ceremonial role. It was a position of practical necessity, born from the dual nature of fire itself. Fire provided warmth. It allowed soldiers to dry wet clothing, to cook food, to melt snow for drinking water. A camp with fire was a camp where men could recover from the day's exertion, where they could eat a hot meal and sleep without shivering through the night. But fire was also a vulnerability. At night, across a flat, snow-covered landscape, a flame could be seen for miles. Smoke carried on the wind, betraying the camp's position to enemy scouts. Even the glow of embers reflected off the canvas of a tent could give away a unit's location. The firemaster managed this paradox. His authority was absolute in matters of fire discipline because a single mistake could endanger the entire force. When conditions allowed for open fires, the firemaster enforced strict rules about fuel selection. Hardwoods were preferred. Oak, beech, and ash burned with a steady heat and produced relatively little smoke. They created long-lasting coals that could be banked overnight and rekindled in the morning. Softwoods, particularly conifers like pine and spruce, were avoided when possible. Their high resin content caused them to burn hot and fast, throwing sparks. These sparks could ignite the straw bedding inside tents or catch on the canvas itself. In the close quarters of a medieval encampment, where tents were often pitched near one another, a single flying ember could start a fire that spread rapidly. The firemaster also determined the placement of fires. Cooking fires were positioned downwind of the main camp so that smoke drifted away rather than through the sleeping areas. Fires for warmth were placed in shallow pits, or surrounded by stones to contain the flames and reflect heat inward. In high-risk situations, when the camp was near enemy territory or when stealth was essential, the firemaster implemented cold camp protocol. This meant no fires at all, or in some cases it meant fires during the day for cooking, which were then extinguished completely before nightfall. Extinguishing a fire properly was as important as managing it while it burned. Simply dousing flames with water was wasteful. It destroyed the coals, which meant that starting a new fire the next morning required fresh tinder and effort. Instead, the firemaster used a technique called ash banking. As evening approached and the order came to extinguish fires, soldiers carefully covered the remaining coals with a layer of fine ash. This ash insulated the coals, slowing their combustion without smothering them entirely. Beneath the ash, the embers stayed alive, glowing faintly, consuming what little oxygen reached them. In the morning, the ash could be brushed aside. The coals beneath, still warm, could be fed with small twigs and brought back to flame with minimal effort. This preserved both time and resources. It also preserved morale. The banked fire was more than a practical tool. It was a psychological anchor. In the deep cold of the night, knowing that embers waited beneath the ash, that warmth could return with the dawn, gave soldiers something to hold on to. It was a promise that the cold was temporary, that morning would come, that they would survive. For the firemaster, the responsibility extended beyond simple fire management. He had to understand wind patterns, how smoke moved across different terrain. He had to judge the visibility conditions, how far a flame could be seen on a clear night versus a foggy one. He had to know which soldiers could be trusted to follow protocol and which needed closer supervision. In some armies, the firemaster was a veteran, someone who had survived multiple winter campaigns and knew the cost of carelessness. In others, he was appointed based on skill with fire itself, on an understanding of how to coax heat from damp wood, or how to keep a flame alive in wind that seemed determined to extinguish it. His authority was respected not because of rank, but because of competence. A knight might command in battle, but in the winter camp, when the question was whether men would freeze, the firemaster's word was final. And when the order came to go cold, when fires were forbidden entirely, the camp had to rely on everything else, on shelter, on insulation, on the heat of bodies pressed close together in the dark. That was when survival became something different, something quieter, something that required not fire, but discipline. When the firemaster gave the order for cold camp, the change was immediate. Fires were extinguished or banked. The warm glow that had defined the camp's perimeter disappeared. Smoke ceased to rise. Within minutes, the encampment became invisible against the winter landscape. For the soldiers, this transition marked the beginning of a different kind of night. Without fire, there was no light, no warmth radiating from a central source, no place to gather, to talk, to dry wet gloves or warm frozen hands. The cold camp was not just the absence of fire, it was a state of tactical discipline that required every man to become self-sufficient in ways that went against instinct. Human beings are drawn to fire. It is a focal point, a source of comfort that goes beyond mere warmth. Fire provides light in darkness. It keeps predators away. It transforms raw food into something safe to eat. For thousands of years, the ability to make and maintain fire has been fundamental to survival. To give that up, to sleep in total darkness with no flame anywhere in the camp was psychologically difficult. It required trust in the systems that had been put in place, trust in the shelter, trust in the layers of wool, trust in the men sleeping nearby. The reasons for cold camp protocol varied. Sometimes it was because the army was operating deep in enemy territory, where any sign of presence could lead to an ambush. Sometimes it was because fuel was scarce, and what little wood had been gathered needed to be saved for morning cooking fires. Sometimes it was simply a matter of weather, high winds that made open flames dangerous, or heavy snow that made gathering firewood impossible. Whatever the reason, the soldiers adapted. The first hours after the fires went out were the hardest. The residual warmth from the day faded quickly. The air inside tents, which had been kept slightly warmer by body heat, and the proximity of nearby fires, began to equalize with the temperature outside. Men prepared for sleep not by removing layers but by adding them. The ritual was methodical. Wet outer garments were removed and set aside, hung from tent poles, or laid flat where they would not freeze to the ground. Dry-wool tunics were pulled on. Stockings were checked for holes, then layered if necessary. The great cloak, the outermost garment, was saved for sleeping. It was heavy, often lined or backed with additional wool. When wrapped around the body and tucked carefully, it created a sealed barrier against the cold. Head coverings were critical. Modern research has confirmed what medieval soldiers understood through experience. A significant portion of body heat escapes through the head and neck. A man who slept with his head uncovered lost warmth at a rate that his body could not easily replace. The coif, a close-fitting hood, was the standard solution. Made of thick wool, sometimes doubled, it covered the head, neck, and often the lower part of the face. It left only the eyes and nose exposed, and even those could be shielded by pulling the cloak up over the lower part of the face. In the cold camp there was no conversation after dark. Voices carried in the still air. Any sound could betray position. So men settled into their bedding in silence, each focused on the task of staying warm. For those on watch, the cold camp presented different challenges. Without fire, there was no way to warm hands or feet during the long hours of standing guard. Movement helped, but it had to be controlled. Pacing back and forth generated heat, but it also made noise. Stamping feet to restore circulation was forbidden. Instead, guards relied on subtle movements, flexing fingers inside gloves, shifting weight from one leg to the other, tensing and relaxing muscle groups in sequence, to maintain blood flow without creating sound. The watch rotation was shorter in cold camp. A man could not remain alert and functional for the standard 4-hour shift when he was also fighting to stay warm. Rotations were reduced to 2 hours, sometimes less. This meant more men had to take turns on watch, but it also meant fewer men succumbing to the cold while supposedly standing guard. For the guards, the world contracted to what could be heard: snow-absorbed sound, creating an eerie acoustic environment where nearby noises were muffled but distant sounds carried with unexpected clarity. The crack of a branch under snow, the low grind of ice shifting in a nearby river, the faint hiss of wind through bare trees. Every sound had to be evaluated. Was it natural? Was it an animal moving through the forest? Or was it the careful approach of an enemy force? In clear weather, visibility improved slightly after the eyes adjusted to the darkness. Starlight reflecting off snow provided enough illumination to see shapes, to distinguish a tree from a man, to track movement across open ground. But on cloudy nights, or during snowfall, the darkness was absolute. Guards relied entirely on hearing. The psychological weight of the cold camp watch was considerable. A guard stood alone, or with one other man nearby, separated from the warmth and relative safety of the sleeping camp. The cold seeped in, fatigue accumulated, and always there was the awareness that an attack could come from any direction, at any moment, with no warning except the sound of footsteps in snow. Yet this was the discipline required. This was the cost of maintaining secrecy, of preserving the tactical advantage that came from an enemy not knowing where you were. And when the watch ended, when a soldier finally returned to his tent and lay down beside his companions, the challenge became something different. It became the challenge of sleep itself. The technique of banking embers was simple in principle, but required precision in execution. As the firemaster prepared to shut down the camp's fires, he first ensured that each fire had burned down to a bed of coals. Wood flames were allowed to die away. What remained was a layer of glowing embers, radiating heat without the visible light of flame. The firemaster, or the soldiers under his direction, then covered these coals with fine ash. The ash came from the fire itself, the residue of wood that had already burned. It was light, powdery, and when spread evenly over the coals it formed an insulating blanket. This blanket slowed combustion. The coals beneath continued to burn, but at a drastically reduced rate. They consumed the small amount of oxygen that filtered through the ash, releasing heat so slowly that the embers could remain alive for hours. The thickness of the ash layer mattered. Too little, and the coals burned through too quickly, leaving nothing by morning. Too much, and the coals suffocated entirely, dying, out before dawn. Experienced firemasters judged this by eye and by feel. They knew how deep the ash needed to be based on the type of wood that had been burned, the size of the coal bed, and the expected length of the night. In the coldest months, when nights stretched for 12 hours or more, additional measures were taken. Larger logs were placed near the coals before banking, positioned so they would catch slowly as the embers burned. This extended the life of the fire without requiring it to blaze openly. When morning came, the process reversed. The ash was carefully brushed aside, exposing the coals beneath. If the banking had been done correctly, these coals still glowed faintly, holding enough heat to ignite fresh tinder. Small twigs, dry bark or straw were placed on the coals. A soldier knelt close, blowing gently to feed oxygen to the embers. The twigs smoked, then caught. Flame appeared. Larger pieces of wood were added, and within minutes the fire was alive again. This saved time. More importantly, it saved effort. Starting a fire from nothing in winter conditions was difficult. Tinder had to be completely dry, which was not always possible. Flint and steel required steady hands, and hands were often numb from the cold. Even when everything was prepared correctly, it could take many attempts to produce a spark that caught. Banked embers eliminated this uncertainty. They were reliable. They were a guaranteed source of fire in the morning, as long as the banking had been done properly. But the value of banked embers went beyond practicality. For soldiers sleeping through a cold camp night, the knowledge that embers waited beneath the ash was psychologically sustaining. Fire represents more than warmth. It represents control over the environment, the ability to cook food, to see in darkness, to signal for help, to defend against threats. A camp without fire felt vulnerable in ways that went beyond physical cold. The banked embers were a promise. They said, "This is temporary, the cold will not last. Morning will come, and with it, warmth will return." This promise mattered. In the deep middle of the night, when the cold was at its worst, when bodies ached and sleep felt impossible, the thought of morning fire was something to hold on to. Some soldiers developed rituals around the banked fire. Before settling into their bedding, they would walk past the fire pit, noting where the ash had been mounded. They would remind themselves that beneath that grey mound heat still lived. Others whispered to each other about the morning fire, what they would cook first, how quickly they would warm their hands, the small routines that would mark the transition from night to day. These conversations were not idle. They served a purpose. They kept the mind focused on survival, on the certainty of dawn, rather than on the discomfort of the present moment. The firemaster understood this. His role was not just to manage flame, but to manage morale. By preserving the embers, he preserved hope, and in the morning, when he uncovered the coals and brought fire back to the camp, he reinforced a fundamental truth. They had survived another night. The cold had not defeated them. They would go on. The ridge tent was the standard mobile shelter for medieval soldiers. Its design was simple: 2 vertical poles, a horizontal ridgepole connecting them, and a covering of canvas or leather draped over the frame. This created a triangular structure, open at both ends or closed with flaps. The covering shed rain and blocked wind, but it provided almost no insulation. Canvas and leather are thin materials. Heat passes through them easily. A tent in winter was only marginally warmer than the air outside. Without modification, it offered little protection against the cold. Soldiers understood this. They did not rely on the tent alone. Instead, they treated it as the outer shell of a more complex system. The first modification was to dig. Before pitching a tent, soldiers often excavated a shallow pit. This pit served multiple purposes. It lowered the floor of the tent, which placed the sleeping area below ground level. Even a shallow depression of 6 inches to a foot made a difference. The ground, once you dig past the frozen surface layer, retains a relatively stable temperature. It does not warm significantly, but it also does not experience the same temperature swings as the air above. At night, when the air temperature dropped sharply, the ground provided a more stable thermal environment. By sleeping in a pit, soldiers also took advantage of the way cold air behaves. Cold air is denser than warm air. It sinks. In a tent with a floor pit, the coldest air naturally settled into the lowest part of the structure. This meant that the sleeping platform, if it was raised even slightly above the pit floor, remained in a layer of relatively warmer air. The difference might only be a few degrees, but over the course of a long night, that difference mattered. Some pits were designed with stepped levels. The centre of the pit was deepest, creating a channel for cold air. The sides were shallower, forming platforms where soldiers laid their bedding. This design exploited convection, the natural movement of air based on temperature. Warm air, generated by the soldiers' bodies, rose to surround them. Cold air sank into the central channel and stayed there. The excavated soil from the pit was not wasted. It was piled around the exterior base of the tent, creating a low earthen wall. This wall blocked drafts that would otherwise slip under the tent's edges. It also provided additional insulation, a barrier between the interior and the frozen ground outside. In some cases, particularly when the camp was expected to last for weeks rather than days, soldiers built more permanent structures. They dug deeper pits and lined them with timber or stone if materials were available. They roofed these pits with logs and sod, creating semi-subterranean shelters that were far more thermally efficient than tents. But for most campaigns, the tent remained the standard, and the key to making it habitable was understanding that the tent itself was not enough. The real shelter was built from layers. First the ground, then insulation on the ground, then the bedding, then the body wrapped in wool, then the tent covering, and finally, if conditions allowed, snow. Snow was one of the most effective insulators available. When piled against the exterior walls of a tent, it created a thick barrier that blocked wind and trapped air. Snow is not solid. It is a matrix of ice crystals with spaces between them. Those spaces contain air, and air is an excellent insulator. A tent with snow banked around its base and partway up its walls could maintain an interior temperature significantly higher than the outside air, simply by capturing and holding the heat generated by the soldiers inside. The process of banking snow was straightforward. Soldiers pidled snow around the tent, packing it loosely rather than compacting it. Loose snow had more air pockets. Compacted snow lost much of its insulating value. The snow did not need to cover the entire tent. Even a partial barrier, rising 2 or 3 feet from the ground, made a substantial difference. It blocked the wind at ground level, where drafts were most likely to penetrate. In deep snow conditions, soldiers sometimes built walls of snow blocks, similar to the way igloos are constructed. These walls created windbreaks that protected multiple tents at once. They also provided a degree of concealment, making the camp harder to spot from a distance. Inside the tent, further modifications continued. Soldiers hung additional fabric or hides from the interior frame, creating a double wall. The space between the outer tent covering and the inner layer trapped air, adding another layer of insulation. They also sealed gaps. Any opening, any place where the tent covering did not meet the ground perfectly, was a point where warm air could escape and cold air could enter. These gaps were stuffed with moss, packed with snow, or covered with extra fabric. The goal was to create a sealed environment, not airtight. Ventilation was necessary to prevent condensation and to allow for breathing, but sealed enough that the heat generated by sleeping bodies stayed inside. This was architecture in its most fundamental form. Not grand structures of stone, but improvised shelters built from canvas, earth and snow. Shelters that existed for a single season, sometimes for just a few nights, before being dismantled and carried to the next camp. But in those nights, they were the difference between survival and death. Snow falls soft, it drifts. It seems insubstantial, something that melts at the slightest warmth. But snow, when understood correctly, becomes one of the most effective building materials available in winter. The key is its structure. Snow is not solid ice. Each snowflake is a crystal of ice, but between those crystals are spaces. When snow accumulates, those spaces remain. The result is a material that is roughly 90% air. Air does not conduct heat well. It is one of the best natural insulators. This is why down feathers keep birds warm, why wool works, why double-paned windows are more efficient than single panes. In each case, the insulating property comes from trapped air. Snow traps air on a massive scale. A layer of snow a foot thick contains countless tiny air pockets, all working to slow the transfer of heat. Medieval soldiers may not have understood the science in these terms, but they understood the effect. They knew that a tent with snow piled against it was warmer than a tent without. They knew that sleeping in a snow cave could be warmer than sleeping in the open, even when the temperature outside was far below freezing. The practice of banking snow against tent walls was widespread in winter. Campaigns. It required no special tools, no expertise beyond basic labour. Soldiers simply shoveled snow from the surrounding area and piled it against the base of the tent. The snow did not need to be shaped or compacted carefully. Loose snow, piled naturally, retained its air pockets and insulated effectively. The only caution was to avoid piling snow so high that it put weight on the tent structure itself, which could cause the frame to collapse. In regions where snow was deep and stable, soldiers sometimes built more elaborate structures. Snow could be cut into blocks using swords or knives. These blocks, stacked in overlapping rows, created walls. A wall of snow blocks, even a low one, blocked wind far more effectively than canvas. Wind carries heat away through convection. When wind is blocked, the air near the body remains still, and the body's heat accumulates rather than being swept away. Snow walls were often built around the perimeter of a camp, creating a sheltered area within. Inside this perimeter, tents experienced less wind, and soldiers moving between tents were not exposed to the full force of winter storms. In some cases, particularly in the Baltic campaigns where the Teutonic Knights operated, soldiers dug into snowbanks to create sleeping chambers. These were not sophisticated structures. They were simple cavities carved into the side of a drift, large enough for 1 or 2 men to crawl into. Once inside, the entrance could be partially blocked with additional snow, leaving only a small opening for ventilation. The snow surrounding the chamber insulated it, body heat accumulated in the enclosed space, raising the temperature to a point where sleep was possible. These snow shelters had limitations. Ventilation was critical. A completely sealed snow chamber would trap carbon dioxide exhaled by the occupants, leading to suffocation. Soldiers learned to leave an opening or to poke ventilation holes through the snow with a stick. They also learned to avoid building snow shelters in areas where the snow might collapse. Fresh, unconsolidated snow was dangerous. Wind-packed snow, or snow that had gone through a freeze-thaw cycle, was more stable. The use of snow extended beyond shelter. Snow could be melted for drinking water, though this required fuel and time. In cold camp conditions where fire was forbidden, soldiers sometimes ate snow directly. This was not ideal. Melting snow in the mouth consumed body heat, but it was better than dehydration. Snow also served as a warning system. Fresh snow recorded movement. Footprints could be tracked. A camp surrounded by undisturbed snow had a clear perimeter. Any approach left marks. For this reason, guards in winter camps often focused their attention on the snow itself. They watched for tracks, for disturbances in the even surface that might indicate someone or something moving nearby. Snow absorbed sound, which made the camp quieter but also made it harder to hear, approaching threats. This acoustic damping meant that guards had to rely more on vision, scanning the snowfield for movement. In moonlight or starlight, snow became a reflective surface. It brightened the landscape, making it easier to see shapes against the white background. This was an advantage for defence, but it also meant that the camp itself was more visible. A camp in the snow could not hide the way a camp in a forest could. So the use of snow was always a balance. It provided insulation, materials for windbreaks, a surface that recorded movement. But it also reflected light, muffled sound, and required constant vigilance to ensure that shelters remained stable. For soldiers, snow was neither friend nor enemy. It was a resource, one more element of the winter environment that could be used if understood correctly. And beneath the snow, beneath the tent, beneath all the layers of canvas and earth, there was still the ground itself. The earth is a heat sink. It absorbs warmth from anything in contact with it. This is true even when the ground itself is frozen. A soldier lying directly on frozen ground loses body heat at an alarming rate. The cold transfers through conduction, through direct contact between the warm body and the cold surface. Clothing provides some barrier, but not enough. A man who sleeps on bare ground in winter will wake, if he wakes, stiff, cold, and dangerously close to hypothermia. Medieval soldiers understood this. The ground was not a place to sleep. It was something to be insulated against. The simplest form of insulation was straw. Straw is the dried stalks of grain plants, hollow tubes that trap air. A pile of straw, even a thin one, creates a barrier between the body and the ground. Straw was widely available in agricultural regions. After the harvest, fields were left covered with it. Barns stored it for winter animal feed. For an army on the move, acquiring straw was often a matter of foraging from nearby farms or taking it from abandoned buildings. The straw was spread thickly on the ground inside tents or shelters. A layer 6 inches deep was standard, though soldiers used whatever they could gather. The straw compressed under the weight of sleeping bodies, but even compressed, it retained enough loft to provide insulation. Loft is the key property. It refers to the thickness of the material, the distance it holds the body away from the ground. The more loft, the more air is trapped, and the better the insulation. Straw had another advantage. It was dry. Dry materials insulate far better than wet ones. As long as the straw was kept dry, it continued to function. If it became wet, from melting snow, from condensation, from spilled water, it lost much of its effectiveness and had to be replaced. In regions where straw was not available, soldiers used other materials. Hay, which is dried grass, served the same purpose. It was slightly less effective than straw because its structure was less rigid, but it was still far better than sleeping on bare ground. Evergreen boughs were another option, particularly in forested areas. Pine, fir, and spruce branches, when layered correctly, created a springy platform that held the body off the ground. The technique was to layer the boughs in a shingle pattern. The cut end of each branch was placed downward, and the tip with the needles pointed upward and away from the sleeping area. This created a surface that was both insulated and relatively comfortable. Evergreen boughs had the additional benefit of remaining somewhat flexible even in cold weather. They did not compress as much as straw. A platform of boughs maintained its loft through the night, continuing to trap air and provide insulation. In some cases, soldiers layered different materials. Boughs on the bottom for structure, straw or hay on top for additional insulation. This combination provided both loft and comfort. Moss and peat were used in areas where they were abundant. Moss, particularly sphagnum moss, is an excellent insulator. It is soft, it holds air, and it remains dry on the surface even when the lower layers are damp. Peat, which is partially decayed plant matter, was denser than moss but still provided good insulation. In northern regions, where peat bogs were common, soldiers harvested it in blocks and used it to line the floors of shelters. All of these materials served the same fundamental purpose, to create a barrier. The ground wanted to take heat from the body. The insulation prevented that transfer, but insulation alone was not enough. The body still lost heat through other pathways. Heat radiated away from exposed skin. It was carried away by air movement, and it was conducted through any part of the body that was not protected. This is where the soldier's bedding came into play. The Heerbedde, the army bed, was mandated by law in some cities. It consisted of a mattress, sheets, a cover and a pillow. These were not luxuries. They were recognised as essential equipment. The mattress, often called a knapsack, was a sack stuffed with straw or feathers. It provided additional loft beyond what was on the ground. A soldier slept on the mattress, which compressed slightly under his weight, but still held him away from the ground beneath. Sheets were typically linen. They protected the skin from the rough texture of the straw-filled mattress and provided a thin, additional layer of insulation. The cover was usually wool. It could be a blanket or a larger piece of fabric that wrapped around the body. Wool's insulating properties were critical here. Even a single wool blanket made a significant difference in how much heat the body retained. The pillow, particularly the bolster pillow, served a specific function. It elevated the head, which helped with breathing. In damp, cold conditions, lying flat could lead to congestion and respiratory difficulty. A raised head kept the airways clearer, but the pillow also had a thermal benefit. It kept the head away from the coldest part of the shelter. Cold air sinks. The lowest part of any enclosed space is the coldest. By elevating the head, the pillow kept it in a slightly warmer layer of air. For soldiers who could not carry full bedding, improvisation was necessary. Cloaks doubled as blankets. Saddlebags or packs served as pillows. Extra clothing was stuffed into sacks to create makeshift mattresses. The principle remained the same. Create layers. Put something between your body and the ground. Put something over your body to hold in heat. Minimize the points of direct contact with cold surfaces. And even with all of this, even with straw on the ground and wool over the body, a soldier sleeping alone in winter faced a losing battle against the cold. The body generates heat, but not enough to warm a large space. A single person in a tent is trying to heat the entire interior with only the 100 watts or so of metabolic energy his body produces. This is where the final layer of survival came into play. Not a material layer, but a human one. Wool is a fibre unlike any other. Its properties made it the foundation of a medieval cold weather survival, not through accident but through the specific structure of the material itself. Each wool fibre is covered in tiny scales. These scales overlap, creating a surface that repels water, even as the fibre's interior can absorb moisture. This is due to lanolin, a waxy substance that sheep produce naturally. Lanolin coats the wool, giving it a hydrophobic quality that causes water to bead and roll off rather than soak in immediately. But wool can absorb moisture. It can hold up to 30% of its weight in water without feeling wet to the touch. More importantly, even when damp, wool continues to insulate. This happens because of the fibre's structure. Wool is crimped, naturally kinked along its length. When wool fibres are spun into yarn and woven or knitted into fabric, these crimps create Kong pockets of air. Air trapped between the fibres is what provides insulation, not the fibre itself. When wool becomes wet, the fibres swell slightly, but the crimped structure remains. The air pockets do not collapse entirely. This means that wet wool, while less effective than dry wool, still functions as insulation. A soldier in a wool tunic that had been soaked by sleet would still retain some body heat, enough to survive where cotton or linen would have failed completely. Medieval soldiers wore wool in layers. The base layer worn against the skin was often linen. Linen is smooth and absorbs sweat, which prevents the moisture from reaching the outer wool layers too quickly. But over the linen came wool. A typical soldier wore a wool tunic, often two. These were not thin garments. Medieval wool fabric was thick, sometimes felted, which meant the fibres had been worked together so tightly that the fabric became almost windproof. Over the tunics came the gambeson. This was a quilted garment, originally designed to be worn under armour. It consisted of multiple layers of linen or wool fabric stitched together, often with padding between the layers. The quilting created channels, and within those channels, air was trapped. A gambeson was heavy, sometimes weighing several pounds, but it was also exceptionally warm. The multiple layers and the trapped air made it one of the most thermally efficient garments a soldier could wear. For sleeping, the gambeson served double duty. It protected against cold, and its padding provided some cushioning against the hard ground or rough bedding. The outermost layer was the great cloak. This was a large, semicircular or rectangular piece of wool, often measuring 6 feet or more in length. It could be wrapped around the body multiple times, creating overlapping layers that sealed in warmth. The great cloak was versatile. During the day, it could be worn draped over the shoulders, leaving the arms free. At night, it became a blanket. A soldier wrapped it around himself, tucking the edges under his body to prevent drafts from entering. Some cloaks were lined with additional wool, or, for those who could afford it, fur. Fur provided even more insulation than wool because the animal hair trapped air with extraordinary efficiency. A fur-lined cloak was warm enough to allow sleep in conditions that would otherwise be lethal. But most soldiers did not have fur. They had wool, multiple layers of it, and they relied on understanding how to use it correctly. Wool had to be kept as dry as possible. Wet wool was better than wet linen or cotton, but dry wool was far superior to wet. So soldiers developed routines for managing moisture. At the end of the day, before settling into sleep, they removed any outer garments that had become wet. These were hung from tent poles or laid flat in a location where they would not freeze to the ground. The goal was to allow air circulation around the fabric so that it could dry, even slightly, overnight. Dry inner layers were preserved. A soldier did not strip down at night. He added layers. If his tunic was dry, he kept it on. If he had a second tunic, he put it on over the first. The gambeson went on next, then the cloak. Head coverings were critical. The coif, a close-fitting wool hood, covered the head, neck, and often the lower face. Medieval soldiers understood through experience that an uncovered head lost heat rapidly. Modern measurements confirm this. In cold conditions, up to 40 or 50% of body heat can be lost through the head and neck if they are not insulated. This is because the head has a large surface area relative to its volume, and the blood vessels in the scalp are close to the surface. A wool coif prevented this loss. It trapped warm air around the head, keeping the scalp warm and reducing the overall rate of heat loss from the body. Hands and feet required similar attention. Wool stockings, sometimes layered, covered the feet. In extreme cold, soldiers wrapped their feet in additional strips of wool fabric before putting on their boots. Gloves or mittens were worn when possible. Mittens were more effective than gloves because they allowed the fingers to share warmth, rather than isolating each finger in its own compartment. But gloves and mittens had a limitation. They made it difficult to handle weapons or equipment. A soldier on watch needed to be able to grip a spear or sword quickly. So gloves were often removed during watch duty, and soldiers relied on keeping their hands tucked inside their cloaks when not in use, or on flexing their fingers repeatedly to maintain circulation. The use of grease or tallow on exposed skin was another practice. Animal fat rubbed into the skin of the hands and face created a thin waterproof layer. This did not provide warmth directly, but it prevented moisture from evaporating off the skin, which would have carried heat away. Tallow also provided some protection against frostbite. Frostbite occurs when skin and underlying tissues freeze. The first sign is numbness, followed by pale or greyish skin. If not treated, frostbite leads to permanent tissue damage. Soldiers learned to recognise the early signs. They checked each other's faces and hands for white patches. They massaged affected areas to restore circulation, and they understood that once frostbite set in, the priority was to prevent it from worsening, not to try to warm the frozen tissue rapidly, which could cause additional damage. Wool, in all its forms, was the primary defence against these dangers. It was not a perfect material. It was heavy when wet. It could harbour lice and other parasites. It required regular maintenance, cleaning and repair. But it worked. It kept men alive in conditions where other materials would have failed. And because wool came from sheep, which were abundant across Europe, it was accessible even to common soldiers who could not afford expensive furs or imported fabrics. Wool was democratic in that sense. A knight might have finer wool, better woven, perhaps dyed or finished more carefully. But the basic properties, the crimped fibres and the trapped air, were the same in the coarse wool tunic of a foot soldier. And when night came, when the cold pressed in and fire was forbidden, wool was what stood between a man and the freezing dark. The transition from day to night in the winter camp followed a pattern. It was not random or hurried. It was methodical, a sequence of actions performed in the same order each evening. This ritual served a practical purpose. It ensured that nothing was forgotten, that each step of preparation was completed before the cold deepened and fingers became too numb to work effectively. As the light began to fade, soldiers returned to their tents or shelters. If fires were allowed, they gathered near them for a final period of warmth. They ate the evening meal, usually something simple that had been cooked earlier in the day or required minimal preparation. After eating, the process of preparing for sleep began. First, wet or damp outer garments were removed. A soldier checked his cloak, his tunic, his stockings. Anything that had absorbed moisture during the day, whether from snow, sweat or melting ice, was taken off and set aside. These garments were not simply thrown into a corner. They were arranged carefully. A cloak was draped over a tent pole or rope, spread out so that air could circulate around it. Stockings were turned inside out and hung separately. Boots were placed upright, open end up, to allow any moisture inside to evaporate. If the ground was frozen, wet items could not be laid directly on it. They would freeze solid, becoming stiff and unwearable. So they were hung or placed on elevated surfaces where they would remain above the frost line. Next came the inspection of dry clothing. Each soldier checked his inner tunic for tears or weak seams. He examined his stockings for holes. Wool, when worn continuously, wore thin at points of friction. Elbows, knees, heels. Small holes were repaired immediately if there was time and light. A soldier carried a needle and thread as part of his basic equipment. A few stitches now prevented a hole from becoming a tear later. If no repairs were needed, or if they could wait, the soldier began to add layers. The inner tunic, if it was dry, stayed on. A second tunic was pulled over it. This was done carefully to avoid dislodging the first layer or creating bunches of fabric that would press uncomfortably against the skin. The gambeson came next. This was a heavier garment, bulkier, and required some effort to put on. A soldier often needed help from a tent mate to adjust the fit, to ensure that the gambeson sat properly on the shoulders and did not restrict movement. Once the gambeson was on, the soldier checked his head covering. The coif was pulled into place, adjusted so that it covered the ears completely and fit snugly around the neck. Loose fabric allowed drafts to enter. Tight fabric held warmth in. Stockings were layered next. If a soldier had multiple pairs, he wore them both. The first pair went on smooth, covering the foot and calf. The second pair went over the first, sometimes extending higher up the leg. Feet were particularly vulnerable to cold. Frostbite occurred most frequently in the extremities: fingers, toes, nose, ears. Keeping the feet warm was not just about comfort. It was about maintaining the ability to walk and fight. Some soldiers wrapped their feet in strips of wool or linen before putting on stockings. This created additional insulation and filled any gaps in worn stockings. Boots, if they were dry, were put on loosely. Tight boots restricted circulation, which made feet colder. Loose boots allowed for thicker stockings and better blood flow. With the body layered, the soldier turned his attention to his bedding. Straw or other ground insulation was checked and fluffed if it had been compressed during the previous night. Additional straw was added if available. The mattress, if the soldier had one, was placed on top of the straw. This was unrolled or positioned carefully to cover the sleeping area. Sheets, if present, were spread over the mattress. The soldier then prepared his sleeping position. He did not simply lie down. He arranged himself deliberately. The great cloak was laid out first, spread across the bedding. The soldier lay down on top of it, then pulled the edges of the cloak up and around his body. The cloak was wrapped tightly, overlapping at the front, with the edges tucked under the body to hold them in place. This created a sealed pod of fabric. Warm air generated by the body accumulated inside this pod. The multiple layers of wool trapped it, preventing it from escaping. The head was positioned on the pillow or bolster. This elevated it above the level of the body, which helped with breathing and kept the head in a slightly warmer layer of air. Arms were kept inside the cloak, close to the body. Hands were tucked into armpits or pressed against the chest. This protected the fingers from the cold, and also warmed them with the body's core heat. Legs were drawn up slightly, not fully extended. A curled position reduced the body's surface area, which reduced the rate of heat loss. It also allowed the legs to warm each other. Once positioned, the soldier remained still. Movement disrupted the layers, allowed warm air to escape, and required the body to expend energy warming the displaced air again. This stillness was part of the discipline. A soldier learned not to shift constantly, not to adjust and readjust. He found a position that was tolerable and held it. If a soldier was sleeping alone, this was the extent of the preparation. But sleeping alone was rare. In most cases, soldiers shared tents, and sharing meant sharing warmth. In medieval military organisation, the lance was a tactical formation. It typically consisted of a knight, his squire, and several supporting soldiers, archers, men-at-arms, servants. The exact composition varied, but the principle was consistent. A small group of men who fought together, travelled together, and depended on each other. At night, the lance became something different. It became a thermal unit. The human body at rest generates approximately 100 watts of heat. This is roughly equivalent to an incandescent light bulb. 100 watts is enough to keep a single body warm if heat loss is minimized. But it is not enough to heat the air inside a tent. A tent in winter is essentially an unheated space. The canvas or leather covering provides a barrier against wind, but it does not insulate significantly. Air temperature inside the tent is only marginally warmer than outside. For a soldier sleeping alone, this means his body must work constantly to replace the heat that escapes. The body burns calories to generate warmth. If those calories run out, if the soldier has not eaten enough, or if his reserves are depleted, his core temperature begins to drop. But when multiple soldiers sleep together, the situation changes. 2 bodies generate 200 watts, 3 generate 300. In a shared tent, this heat accumulates. The air inside warms slightly, not to a comfortable level, but enough to reduce the rate of heat loss from each individual body. More importantly, bodies in close proximity share warmth through radiation and conduction. Heat radiates from one body to another. When soldiers sleep pressed against each other, they create a collective thermal mass that is far more resistant to cooling than any individual could achieve alone. This practice was common enough that it had a name in some regions. The British called it to pig, a reference to the way pigs huddle together for warmth. The arrangement was practical. 2 or 3 soldiers shared a single sleeping space. They lay side by side, often under a shared cloak or blanket. The cloak draped over all of them, creating a common insulated pod. Body heat from each soldier warmed the air inside this pod. The trapped air in turn warmed all of them. The system was self-reinforcing. The more bodies, the more heat. The more heat, the warmer the shared space. There were variations on this arrangement. In some cases, soldiers slept in a line, each man's back pressed against the next man's front. This maximised contact area and minimised the exposed surface area of the group. In other cases, soldiers slept in a cluster, with younger or smaller men positioned in the middle, where they benefited most from the warmth of those around them. The shared sleeping arrangement was not just about heat. It was about survival in a more fundamental sense. A soldier who slept alone and fell into deep hypothermia might not wake. His tent mates would not know until morning that something was wrong. By then, it could be too late. but a soldier sleeping in a group was monitored, even unconsciously. If one man began to shiver violently, the movement woke the others. If one man became too cold and shifted, trying to press closer for warmth, his companions felt it. This proximity allowed for intervention. A soldier who was dangerously cold could be surrounded more completely by his tent mates, their bodies warming him. Extra cloaks could be piled on top of him. He could be roused, forced to move, to eat, to do something that generated heat. The shared sleeping space also had psychological benefits. The winter night in a cold camp was silent and dark. Without fire, there was no light, no focal point, no sense of a protected space. The darkness was complete, and the cold was invasive. For a soldier alone, this environment could be psychologically overwhelming. The mind, in the absence of stimulation, turns inward. Anxiety builds. The cold becomes not just physical discomfort, but a source of fear. But with companions nearby, this changed. The sound of another man's breathing, the warmth of another body, the knowledge that you were not alone, these things provided comfort. Soldiers talked to each other in the dark, though not loudly. Whispered conversations about home, about food, about plans for the next day. These conversations were not frivolous. They were a way of staying connected, of maintaining morale, of reminding each other that morning would come. Sometimes, soldiers recited things they had memorized. Prayers were common. So were songs spoken rather than sung to avoid making noise that could carry. And sometimes they recited recipes. This practice appears in accounts of medieval campaigns, though it is mentioned only in passing. Soldiers would describe in detail how to prepare a particular dish: roasted goose, meat pie, thick stew with vegetables and herbs. The descriptions were elaborate, almost ritualistic. They included every step, every ingredient, every detail of preparation. The recitation could take many minutes, and other soldiers would listen, sometimes adding their own variations. This served multiple purposes. It distracted from the cold. It occupied the mind with something other than discomfort. And it created a shared experience, a communal act that reinforced the bonds between the men. Food, even imaginary food, was comforting. The memory of warmth, of satiation, of the sensory pleasure of eating, these memories provided a psychological anchor. And in the morning, when the camp woke and fires were rekindled, the soldiers who had survived the night together had a story to share. They had endured. They had kept each other alive. This was not dramatic heroism. It was ordinary, repeated every night, as much a part of the campaign as marching or standing guard. But it was heroism nonetheless, the quiet kind, written into the body rather than into chronicles. To sleep beside another person is to enter a state of vulnerability. You're close enough to hear their breathing, to feel the heat radiating from their body, to sense their presence without seeing them. In normal life, this intimacy is reserved for family, for spouses, for relationships built on trust and affection. In the winter camp, it was necessity. Soldiers who shared sleeping space were often strangers to each other at the start of a campaign. They came from different villages, different backgrounds. They spoke different dialects. They had different beliefs, different habits. But the cold erased some of these differences. When survival depended on proximity, when you needed another man's warmth as much as he needed yours, social boundaries became less important. The shared cloak was a symbol of this. A single, large piece of wool draped over multiple bodies. It did not belong to one person. It belonged to the group, at least for the duration of the night. Beneath the cloak, bodies pressed together, shoulders touched, legs overlapped. The contact was not romantic or affectionate. It was functional, but it was still intimate. Men who had never touched each other during the day found themselves entangled at night. An arm draped across another man's chest to share warmth. A hand tucked into a companion's armpit for protection from the cold. Backs pressed together, sharing the heat that radiated from the spine and core. This contact was accepted without comment because it was normal. It was what everyone did. There was no shame in it, no awkwardness, because the alternative was freezing. The breathing of a sleeping man is a steady rhythm. In a shared sleeping space, that rhythm became part of the soundscape of the night. One man's breath, then another's, slightly out of sync, creating a pattern that was both mechanical and organic. For the soldier who was still awake, listening to his companion's breathing was reassuring. It meant they were alive, that they were sleeping, that they were warm enough to relax. If the breathing changed, if it became shallow or irregular, it was a warning sign. A soldier who was too cold often began to breathe more rapidly, his body trying to compensate for the loss of heat. A companion who noticed this might wake the man, check on him, add another layer of covering. The shared sleeping space also created a kind of mutual accountability. A soldier who was struggling could not hide it completely. His shivering would wake the others, his shifting and restlessness would disturb them. This was not always welcome. Tired men wanted to sleep, not to be jostled awake. But it was also protective. It meant that no one was left to suffer alone, to slip quietly into hypothermia while the others slept unaware. In the morning, when the group woke, there was often a moment of stillness. The transition from sleep to wakefulness was gradual. Men lay beneath the shared cloak, unwilling to be the first to move, to break the seal and let the cold air in. Eventually someone had to move. Usually it was whoever had the watch, or whoever was assigned to rekindle the fire. That person would sit up, pulling the cloak off the others, and the cold would rush in. The others would groan, pull their own cloaks tighter, burrow deeper into the straw. But within moments they too would be up, because lying in the cold without the shared warmth was pointless. The morning routine reversed the evening routine. Layers were removed one by one, stiff garments were checked, boots were inspected for ice or damage. The mattress was rolled up, the straw was redistributed if it had compressed unevenly, and the men who had slept together, who had shared warmth through the night, went back to being separate individuals. They resumed their roles, knight, squire, soldier, each with his own tasks, his own responsibilities. But the memory of the night remained, the knowledge that they had depended on each other, that they had survived together. This created bonds that were difficult to describe but easy to feel. Soldiers who had wintered together often stayed together in subsequent campaigns. They trusted each other in ways that went beyond ordinary camaraderie, because they had seen each other at their most vulnerable. They had felt each other shiver. They had heard each other whisper in the dark. They had shared the small, unremarkable act of staying alive through a winter night. And that was something that could not be faked or forgotten. In some medieval cities, the equipment a soldier was required to bring on campaign was specified by law. These laws were not suggestions. They were enforceable regulations, part of the civic duty that came with citizenship or status. Among the items mandated was the Heerbedde, the army bed. The word itself is telling. Heer means army. Bedde means bed. The army bed was recognised as a distinct category of equipment, separate from weapons or armour, but no less essential. The laws varied by city and by time period, but the general requirements were consistent. A soldier of a certain rank was required to bring a mattress, sheets, a cover, and a pillow. In Braunschweig, a law from the year 1320 specified that a soldier must bring a coverlet, a pillow, and 2 sheets. These items were to be portable, suitable for transport on campaign. In Oldenburg, a law from 1345 required a mattress, a cover, and a bolster pillow. The emphasis on the bolster, a long cylindrical pillow, suggests an understanding of its specific function in maintaining comfort and health during sleep. Lübeck had sumptuary laws that regulated not just the presence of bedding, but its quality. There were limits on the weight of bolster pillows, a recognition that soldiers had to carry their equipment, and that excessive weight was impractical. These laws were not unique to German cities. Similar regulations appeared across Europe, wherever urban militias were organised. The existence of these laws tells us something important. It tells us that the medieval authorities understood that sleep was not a luxury. It was a functional necessity, as critical to maintaining a fighting force as ensuring that soldiers had swords and shields. A soldier who did not sleep well was a soldier who could not fight effectively. He was slower, less alert, more prone to mistakes. He was also more vulnerable to illness, to injury, to the cumulative effects of fatigue. By requiring soldiers to bring proper bedding, cities were protecting their investment. They were ensuring that the men they sent to war would return, or at least that they would be effective while they served. The mattress, the knapsack, was typically a cloth sack filled with straw, or, for those who could afford it, feathers. Straw mattresses were heavier and less comfortable, but they were functional. Feather mattresses were lighter, softer and warmer, but they were expensive. A soldier's wealth, or his family's wealth, determined which type he carried. But both types served the same basic purpose. They kept the sleeper off the ground, providing a layer of insulation and cushioning. The sheets were usually linen. Linen is smooth, durable and relatively easy to wash. It absorbed sweat and protected the mattress from becoming soiled. In winter, linen sheets were less important for warmth than for hygiene, but they still contributed to overall comfort. The cover was the most critical item for warmth. It was typically wool, heavy and large enough to wrap around the body completely. Some covers were lined or doubled, creating additional insulation. The bolster pillow served multiple functions. It elevated the head, which improved breathing and reduced congestion. It also kept the head away from the coldest air at ground level. There is evidence that the shape and size of bolsters were carefully considered. A bolster that was too soft collapsed under the weight of the head, providing no support. A bolster that was too firm was uncomfortable and caused neck strain. The ideal bolster was firm enough to maintain its shape but soft enough to conform slightly to the head and neck. It was long enough to support the entire length of the shoulders, distributing weight evenly. For soldiers who campaigned frequently, the Heerbedde was not a burden. It was familiar equipment, as much a part of their gear as their weapons. They knew how to pack it efficiently, how to keep it dry, how to set it up quickly at the end of a day's march. For new soldiers, learning to manage the Heerbedde was part of their training. They learned that a well-maintained bed was easier to carry, that a mattress stuffed too full was difficult to roll, that wet sheets were heavy and took days to dry. They also learned that the Heerbedde was not just for their own use. In some cases, officers inspected bedding to ensure compliance with regulations. A soldier who showed up without proper equipment could be fined or sent home. This level of oversight reinforced the idea that sleep was a disciplined activity, not something left to chance or individual preference. The laws also reflected social distinctions. Wealthy soldiers, knights, and nobles were expected to bring more elaborate bedding. They might have multiple mattresses, silk or fine linen sheets, fur covers, and embroidered pillows. Common soldiers had simpler gear, but the baseline requirements were the same. Everyone, regardless of rank, was required to have something to sleep on, something to cover themselves with. This created a kind of equality in the camp, at least in terms of basic needs. A knight's bed might be more comfortable, but both he and the common soldier beside him understood the necessity of proper bedding. And when the night grew cold, when fire was forbidden and the temperature dropped, the quality of a man's bedding could matter more than the quality of his armour. Because armour protected in battle, bedding protected every night. The body is a furnace. It burns fuel to produce heat. In winter, when external sources of warmth are scarce or forbidden, the body's internal fire becomes the only defence against the cold. But this fire requires feeding. A soldier in winter conditions needed far more food than a soldier in temperate weather. The body expended energy simply maintaining its core temperature. Every hour spent in the cold burned through calories that had to be replaced. Modern studies of soldiers operating in extreme cold suggest that daily caloric needs can reach between 4,500 and 7,000 calories. This is more than double the requirements of a sedentary person in moderate conditions. Medieval soldiers did not measure calories, but they understood hunger. They understood that a man who did not eat enough grew weak, that his hands shook, that he could not think clearly, that he felt cold no matter how many layers he wore. The type of food mattered as much as the quantity. Fat was the most valuable fuel. It provided 9 calories per gram compared to 4 calories per gram for carbohydrates or protein. For a soldier carrying limited supplies, fat was the most efficient way to deliver energy. Salt pork was a staple. It was fatty, preserved for long storage, and could be eaten with minimal preparation. A soldier might eat it raw, cutting thin slices with his knife, or he might render it over a fire to produce both cooked meat and liquid fat. Lard was carried in leather pouches or clay pots. It could be spread on bread, mixed into porridge, or eaten directly. Some soldiers added lard to hot water or ale, creating a fatty broth that provided both hydration and calories. Clarified butter served a similar purpose. It was more expensive than lard, but it had a cleaner taste and could be stored for months without spoiling. These high-fat foods were not just about energy. Fat, when consumed, generated heat during digestion. The body worked to break down the fat molecules, and that metabolic work produced warmth. A soldier who ate a fatty meal before sleep felt warmer for the first few hours of the night. His body was actively processing the food, burning it for energy, and that process generated internal heat that radiated outward. Protein had a similar effect, though through a different mechanism. The thermogenic effect of feeding refers to the energy required to digest, absorb, and process nutrients. Protein has the highest thermogenic effect of any macronutrient. The body uses roughly 20 to 30% of the calories in protein just to digest it. This means that protein not only provided energy, but also generated heat as a byproduct of its own digestion. Dried or salted fish was a common protein source. It was lightweight, preserved well, and could be reconstituted in water or eaten dry. Legumes, peas, beans, lentils were another option. They were less convenient because they required soaking and long cooking, but when conditions allowed for a hot meal, they provided substantial protein. For soldiers who could hunt or forage, fresh meat was ideal. A rabbit, a deer, even a bird provided protein and fat together. The meat could be roasted over a fire during the day, then eaten cold at night. Carbohydrates were important for quick energy, but they burned faster than fat or protein. Bread was the primary carbohydrate source. Soldiers carried hard bread, sometimes called army bread, which was baked until it was nearly rock hard to prevent spoiling. This bread was not eaten dry. It was broken into pieces and soaked in water, ale, or broth to soften it. The soaked bread absorbed liquid, becoming edible and providing both calories and hydration. Porridge was another option. Oats or barley cooked with water created a thick, filling meal. Fat could be added to increase the caloric density. In winter, a bowl of hot porridge in the morning provided energy that lasted through the cold day. But food was not always abundant. Campaigns that stretched into winter often faced supply problems. Roads became impassable. Rivers froze, cutting off water transport. Foraging opportunities disappeared as the land froze over. When food was scarce, soldiers rationed carefully. They ate just enough to maintain function, conserving supplies for as long as possible. Hunger became a constant companion. A soldier who was hungry felt colder, even if he was wearing the same layers as a well-fed man. The body, lacking fuel, could not generate as much heat. Dehydration compounded the problem. In cold weather, the body still lost water through respiration and minimal sweating. But the urge to drink often decreased because cold suppressed thirst. Soldiers had to drink deliberately, not just when they felt thirsty. Water was the simplest option, but in winter, water sources often froze. Soldiers melted snow over fires, though this required fuel and time. Ale was a more reliable source of hydration. It did not freeze as easily as water, and it provided calories as well as liquid. A soldier's daily ale ration was not just for morale, it was functional hydration. On the coldest nights, some soldiers heated their ale. They placed hot stones into their mugs, warming the liquid before drinking it. The hot ale provided a brief internal warmth, a sensation of heat spreading from the stomach outward. There was an understanding, though, that alcohol had limits. A soldier who drank too much felt warm initially, but the warmth was deceptive. Alcohol dilated blood vessels near the skin, which allowed heat to escape more quickly. A drunk soldier was a cold soldier, and a cold soldier was a liability. So ale was consumed in moderation, enough for comfort and hydration, not enough to impair judgment or accelerate heat loss. The evening meal, when it was possible to have one, was timed carefully. Eating too early meant the thermogenic effect wore off before sleep. Eating too late meant digesting while trying to settle down, which could be uncomfortable. The ideal was to eat an hour or two before, lying down. This allowed the initial burst of digestive heat to warm the body, then sustained warmth through the early part of the night. For soldiers in cold camp conditions, where fires were forbidden after dark, the evening meal was often the last source of external warmth they would have until morning, so they ate deliberately. They chewed slowly, savouring not just the taste but the heat. They drank their ale in measured sips. They prepared their bodies for the long cold hours ahead. And when the meal was finished, when the last of the food was gone and the mugs were set aside, they turned to the work of sleeping. Because the internal hearth, while essential, was not enough on its own. It had to be protected, insulated, preserved through the night. And that required more than food. It required discipline. The strategies outlined in regulations and passed down through training covered most situations. But winter campaigns were unpredictable. Equipment was lost or damaged. Supplies ran short. Men found themselves in conditions they had not prepared for. In these moments, survival depended on improvisation. One of the most widely used techniques was the hot stone method. It was simple, requiring only access to fire and stones. During the day, when fires were permitted, soldiers placed stones near the flames, not directly in the fire, which could cause them to crack or explode, but close enough to absorb significant heat. The stones needed to be smooth and dense. River stones were ideal. Porous stones, like some types of sandstone, could trap water. When heated, that water turned to steam, and the expanding steam could shatter the stone. Once the stones were heated, they were handled carefully. A soldier wrapped a hot stone in a piece of wool or stuffed it into a thick sock. The fabric protected his hands from burns and helped retain the stone's heat. The wrapped stone could then be placed inside clothing, held against the body or tucked into bedding. A stone, heated to the point where it was almost too hot to touch, could radiate warmth for 6 to 8 hours. Some soldiers placed hot stones at their feet, where cold was most acute. Others held them against their core, warming the chest and stomach. A stone tucked into the small of the back warmed the spine, from which heat radiated to the rest of the body. The technique had limitations. Stones were heavy, adding weight to a soldier's gear. They cooled eventually, becoming just another cold object to carry. And if the fabric wrapping was too thin, the stone could burn skin or scorch clothing. But for a soldier facing a night without fire, a hot stone was a significant advantage. It provided hours of localized warmth, enough to stave off the worst of the cold during the critical early hours of sleep. Another improvisation involved the use of animal materials. Soldiers scavenged horsehair from dead animals, or from the manes and tails of living horses. This hair, when stuffed into gloves or wrapped around feet, added insulation. Horsehair is coarse and springy. It does not compress easily, which means it maintains loft even under pressure. A glove stuffed with horsehair was bulkier but significantly warmer than an empty glove. Feathers, when available, served a similar purpose. A handful of feathers stuffed into a sock or tucked inside a tunic provided surprising warmth. Feathers trap air with exceptional efficiency, which is why birds can survive in cold climates. Soldiers also used parchment, the treated animal skin used for writing. Parchment was relatively wind-resistant. Wrapped around the legs or torso, it created a barrier that blocked drafts. The practice of soaking cloth in urine, then wrapping it around exposed skin, appears in some accounts. The logic behind this is unclear. Some believed that the ammonia in urine provided a chemical warming effect or acted as a wind barrier. Modern understanding suggests that any benefit was minimal, but the practice persisted in some regions. More effective was the use of grease or tallow. Animal fat rendered from pigs or cattle could be rubbed onto the skin of the hands, face and feet. This created a thin, oily layer that repelled moisture and provided some insulation. The grease did not warm the skin directly, but it prevented evaporative cooling. When moisture on the skin evaporates, it carries heat away. By blocking that evaporation, grease helped retain body heat. Soldiers applied grease before going on watch, before sleeping, or any time they expected prolonged exposure to cold. The smell was unpleasant, and the grease attracted dirt, but these were minor concerns compared to frostbite. In forested areas, soldiers used bark and moss to insulate shelters. Bark, peeled from fallen trees, could be layered like shingles to cover gaps in tent walls. Moss, particularly sphagnum moss, was stuffed into cracks and openings. Moss is remarkably effective at blocking drafts. It is soft, compressible, and retains some insulating value even when damp. A tent chinked with moss was noticeably warmer than one left open to the wind. Soldiers also learned to use their own bodies strategically. When standing watch, a soldier who was beginning to feel dangerously cold would perform controlled exercises. Not vigorous movement, which would generate sweat and noise, but small, repetitive motions. Flexing the toes inside boots, clenching and unclenching fists, tensing the muscles of the thighs and calves in sequence. These movements increased blood flow and generated metabolic heat without breaking discipline. For soldiers sharing a tent, one technique was to rotate positions through the night. The men on the outside of a sleeping group were more exposed to cold. The men in the middle were warmer. By switching positions periodically, the group ensured that no one spent the entire night in the coldest spot. This required coordination and discipline, because it meant waking and moving in the dark, but it distributed the burden of cold more evenly. All of these improvisations shared a common thread. They were born from necessity, refined through trial, and passed from soldier to soldier through experience rather than formal instruction. They were the hidden knowledge of survival, the small tricks that did not appear in training manuals but that every veteran knew. And they were a reminder that survival was not passive. It was active, creative, relentless. It required paying attention, adapting, using whatever was available, because the cold did not care about regulations or plans. It was indifferent to rank or wealth. It tested everyone equally. And those who survived were those who learned to improvise. The physical challenges of the winter night were measurable. Temperature, wind speed, the rate of heat loss. These could be understood, planned for, managed. The psychological challenges were harder to define, but no less dangerous. A soldier lying in darkness, wrapped in wool, surrounded by the cold, faced hours of consciousness with nothing to occupy his mind. No visual stimulation, no tasks to complete, just the awareness of discomfort and the slow passage of time. For some, this was unbearable. The mind, deprived of input, turns inward. It magnifies small discomforts into larger anxieties. A cold foot becomes an obsession. The sound of wind becomes ominous. The darkness becomes oppressive. In this state, fear could grow. Fear of freezing, fear of attack, fear of never being warm again. These fears were not irrational. They were based on real dangers, but they could become paralyzing. A soldier who succumbed to fear stopped thinking clearly. He made poor decisions. He might abandon his post, seeking warmth or shelter that did not exist. Or he might simply give up, lying still, allowing the cold to take him. To combat this, soldiers developed psychological strategies. One of the most curious was the recitation of recipes. This practice appears in fragmentary accounts of medieval campaigns. Soldiers, lying in their tents, would describe aloud how to prepare specific dishes. The descriptions were detailed, almost ritualistic. A soldier might describe how to roast a goose. He would begin with selecting the bird, plucking and cleaning it. He would describe the preparation of stuffing, bread, herbs, perhaps chestnuts. He would explain how to truss the bird, how to position it over the fire, how to baste it with its own fat. The description could take 10 or 15 minutes. Other soldiers would listen, occasionally interjecting their own variations. One might suggest a different herb. Another might describe how his mother prepared the dish differently. These conversations served multiple purposes. First, they distracted from the cold. The mind, focused on the detailed process of cooking, was not focused on discomfort. The recitation required concentration, remembering the steps, choosing the right words, which occupied mental resources that might otherwise spiral into anxiety. Second, they evoked warmth. The description of roasting meat, of fire, of hot food, created a psychological association with comfort. Even though the food was imaginary, the act of describing it provided a small measure of emotional warmth. Third, they built solidarity. The shared experience of listening to and contributing to the recipe created a sense of community. The soldiers were doing something together, even if that something was just talking. And fourth, they were a link to home. Food was tied to memory, to family, to specific places and times. Describing a dish was a way of remembering life outside the camp, outside the cold, outside the war. It was a reminder that this state, cold, dark, uncomfortable, was temporary, that somewhere hearths were warm and food was plentiful and life continued in its ordinary patterns. The practice of recipe recitation was sometimes called the culinary lullaby. The steady rhythm of the description, the familiar patterns of preparation had a calming effect. Some soldiers fell asleep listening, their minds occupied with images of food rather than fear. Prayer served a similar function. Soldiers recited memorized prayers, sometimes aloud, sometimes silently. The repetition was soothing. The words were familiar, requiring no thought, allowing the mind to settle. For some, prayer was more than routine. It was genuine comfort, a connection to faith that provided strength. For others, it was simply a mental exercise, a way of marking time and occupying the mind. Songs were another tool, though they had to be whispered or spoken rather than sung. A soldier might recite the words of a ballad, a marching song, a tune from childhood. The rhythm and structure of the song helped organize thought, preventing it from wandering into dark places. Some soldiers counted. They counted breaths, heartbeats, the number of times they flexed their toes. Counting gave the mind a task. Simple, repetitive action that required just enough attention to prevent spiraling thoughts. Others focused on sensory details. They paid attention to the texture of a wool against their skin, the weight of the cloak over their body, the sound of a companion's breathing. By anchoring awareness in the present, in physical sensations, they avoided getting lost in abstract fears. For soldiers on watch, the challenge was different. They could not afford to lose focus. They had to remain alert, scanning the darkness, listening for sounds that might indicate danger. But the watch was also isolating. A guard stood apart from the warmth and companionship of the sleeping camp. He was alone with the cold and the dark. To manage this, guards often worked in pairs when possible. Two men standing watch together could talk quietly, keeping each other alert and providing mutual support. When a guard was alone, he relied on routine. He established a pattern of movement, pacing a specific route, turning at specific intervals. The routine kept him active, generating a small amount of heat, and it gave him a structure to follow. Some guards talked to themselves, though quietly. A whispered reminder of the watch schedule, a quiet assessment of the weather, a muttered prayer. The sound of a human voice, even one's own, was reassuring. The psychological weight of the night watch was acknowledged by commanders. Watch rotations were kept short, especially in the coldest weather. A man who stood watch for too long became less effective, his attention wandering, his body succumbing to fatigue and cold. Relief came not just in the form of being able to sleep, but in the return to companionship. A guard who completed his shift and returned to his tent rejoined the collective warmth, both physical and psychological. For all soldiers, the knowledge that morning would come was essential. The night was not endless, though it sometimes felt that way. Dawn would arrive, the fires would be rekindled. The cold would ease, if only slightly. This certainty, that time moved forward, that the night would end, was what allowed men to endure. They did not have to survive forever. They only had to survive until morning, and morning always came. The night watch in a cold camp was a world reduced to sound and shadow. Vision, even on clear nights, was limited. The human eye adapts to darkness, but that adaptation takes time. A guard stepping out from the relative shelter of a tent into the open needed several minutes before he could see with any clarity. Even then, what he saw was minimal, shapes rather than details, the outline of a tree against the sky, the dark mass of the camp's perimeter. Movement, if anything moved. On cloudy nights, or during snowfall, vision was almost useless. The darkness was complete, broken only by the faint differentiation between ground and sky. So the guard learned to see with his ears. Sound in a winter landscape behaves strangely. Snow absorbs acoustic energy. It dampens noise, making the world quieter than it would be in other seasons. Footsteps on snow are muffled. The crunch of ice underfoot carries a short distance and then stops, absorbed by the snow around it. This makes approaching footsteps harder to hear, which is why guards had to listen with complete attention. But some sounds travelled better. The crack of a branch breaking under weight was sharp, distinct. It carried across open ground, especially in still air. The sound of metal, a sword scraping against a scabbard, chainmail clinking, was unmistakable. Metal rang in the cold, a bright sound that stood out against the muffled background. Ice made its own noises. In rivers or ponds, ice shifted and settled, creating low groans and sharp cracks. A guard near water learned to distinguish between the natural sounds of ice and the sounds of something moving on it. Wind was constant in many winter camps. It hissed through bare branches, whistled around tent, corners, rustled dry grasses poking through snow. These sounds were steady, part of the background. What the guard listened for was disruption, a change in the pattern, a sound that did not fit. A guard on watch stood or paced slowly, his body angled to present the smallest profile to the wind. He kept his hands covered as much as possible, tucked into his cloak or armpits when not gripping a weapon. His weapon, usually a spear or pike, served as much as a support as a tool of defence. Leaning slightly on the shaft helped distribute weight, easing the strain on legs and back during long periods of standing. Every so often, the guard stopped moving entirely. He stood still, listening. In the absence of his own footsteps, other sounds became clearer. The breathing of sentries at other posts if the camp was quiet enough. The distant sound of a horse shifting in its enclosure. The faint crackle of banked embers if someone lifted ash to check them. And beneath all of this, the silence. Silence in a winter camp was not empty. It was full of small sounds, layered and subtle. But it felt like silence because there was no human voice, no fires crackle, no activity. This silence was psychological weight. It pressed in, making the guard acutely aware of his isolation. Some guards hummed, almost inaudibly, just to hear something human. Others whispered prayers or lists, names of family members, places they had been, things they would do when the campaign ended. The act of speaking, even in a whisper, was a way of asserting presence, of reminding oneself that one existed, that one was still thinking, still functioning. When two guards shared a post, they stood close enough to speak quietly without raising their voices. The conversation was minimal, practical. Anything? No. Cold. Yes. But even these brief exchanges were grounding. They confirmed that another person was there, that the watch was shared. For the guard alone, time moved differently. Without conversation, without tasks, the hours stretched. A 2-hour watch could feel twice as long. To manage this, guards developed internal rhythms. They counted paces, marked intervals by the position of stars if the sky was clear, or simply endured by focusing on the task itself. The coldest part of the night was usually in the hours just before dawn. The temperature dropped to its lowest point. The body, having burned through much of its energy reserves during the day, was least able to generate heat. This was when guards were most vulnerable. Fatigue accumulated. The cold became harder to ignore. Attention wavered. Commanders knew this. The watch rotation just before dawn was sometimes assigned to the most experienced men, those who could be trusted to stay alert even when exhausted and freezing. When dawn finally approached, the change was gradual. The sky lightened almost imperceptibly at first. The stars faded. The shapes of trees and tents became more defined. The guard on the final watch of the night saw this transition. He watched the world emerge from darkness, the details returning one by one. And with the light came the end of his duty. Another guard, freshly woken, came to relieve him. A brief exchange. Quiet night. Good. And the watch changed. The relieved guard returned to his tent, to the warmth of sleeping companions, to the possibility of rest before the camp woke fully. But for a few moments, as he walked back, he carried with him the sensory world of the watch, the memory of sound in darkness, the weight of silence, the cold that had pressed against him for hours. It was not an experience he would describe to others, because there was nothing to describe. It was ordinary, repeated every night, part of the routine of the camp, but it was also singular. Each watch was its own small endurance, its own quiet test, and each guard who completed it had survived another piece of the winter night. The Viking great army that arrived in England in the 9th century did not retreat when winter came. They established fortified camps and stayed. At Torksey, in what is now Lincolnshire, archaeological evidence shows a massive encampment occupied during the winter of 872 to 873. The site covered 26 hectares, large enough to hold several thousand people. This was not a temporary bivouac, it was a settlement. Excavations have revealed traces of workshops where metal was worked, weapons repaired, tools forged. There were areas for craft work, for leatherworking, for the maintenance of equipment. There were merchants, traders who followed the army and provided goods in exchange for plunder or payment. The camp was positioned strategically. The River Trent protected one side. Marshland surrounded much of the perimeter. These natural barriers made the camp difficult to attack and easy to defend. Within the camp, shelters ranged from simple tents to more substantial structures. Some buildings had posts, holes indicating timber frames. Others showed signs of earthen walls built up from the excavated soil of defensive ditches. The Vikings did not simply endure winter, they used it. They repaired equipment that had been damaged in the campaigning season. They rested. They planned for the next phase of the war. This practice of overwintering allowed the Viking armies to maintain pressure on their enemies even when active campaigning was impossible. A fortified winter camp was a statement of intent. It said, "We are not leaving. We will be here when spring comes." The logistics of overwintering were formidable. Thousands of people required food, and food had to be either brought in or taken from the surrounding area. The Vikings relied on a combination of both. They demanded tribute from local populations, essentially forcing the nearby settlements to supply the army through the winter. They also stockpiled goods taken during the previous months of raiding. Grain was stored in pits or containers. Salted or smoked meat was preserved in barrels. Animals were kept alive when possible, slaughtered as needed to provide fresh meat. Fuel for fires was another constant need. An army of several thousand people burned through enormous quantities of wood. Foraging parties went out daily, cutting and hauling timber back to the camp. Water, at least, was abundant. The river provided a reliable source, though it had to be accessed carefully. Ice could form at the edges, and the current in the centre was dangerous. The social structure of the winter camp was complex. There were warriors, but also non-combatants. Families sometimes travelled with the army. Children were present. The camp was not purely military, it was a mobile society. This created a different atmosphere than a campaign camp. There were routines of daily life, food preparation, clothing repair, children playing in the snow, markets where goods were traded. But the military purpose remained. Sentries stood watch. Weapons were maintained, training continued, though at a reduced pace. The Teutonic Knights, operating in the Baltic region, took a different approach to winter. They did not establish large permanent camps. Instead, they used winter as a season for movement. The Winterizer, the Winter Journey, was a specialised campaign that took advantage of frozen rivers and marshes. In summer, the region was nearly impassable, a maze of waterways and bogs. In winter, it became a highway. The knights moved with supply sleds across the ice, striking at Lithuanian and Prussian settlements. These raids were brutal, intended to weaken and intimidate the local populations. The knights viewed winter as a testing ground, a landscape that separated the faithful from the weak. The cold was a form of trial, and surviving it was evidence of divine favour. Their winter camps were temporary, often just a single night. They relied on cold camp protocols extensively, maintaining stealth and surprise. The knights brought guides, local converts or prisoners who knew the terrain. These guides were essential. The frozen landscape was deceptive. Rivers that looked solid could have thin spots. Paths that seemed direct could lead into dead ends or dangerous areas. The winterize was exhausting. The knights and their soldiers moved quickly, covering ground before the ice began to thaw. They endured extreme cold, often without fires, sleeping in improvised shelters or in the open. But the strategy was effective. It allowed the Teutonic Order to maintain pressure on their enemies year-round, preventing them from consolidating or resting. Both approaches, the Viking overwintering and the Teutonic winter rise, demonstrated that winter did not have to mean the end of campaigning. It meant adaptation. Armies that understood how to survive winter, how to use it rather than simply endure it, had a strategic advantage. They could continue operations when their enemies expected them to withdraw. They could strike when defences were weakest. They could maintain momentum, ensuring that the next campaigning season began from a position of strength. But this required more than tactics. It required logistics. It required knowledge of how to keep men alive in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. It required understanding fire, shelter, clothing, food, and the management of communal warmth. It required discipline, routine, and the ability to turn survival into a systematic practice rather than a desperate gamble. And for the soldiers who lived through these winters, who woke each morning after another cold night, the experience became part of their identity. They were men who had survived what others had not attempted. They had learned to sleep without fire, to endure without complaint, to function in conditions that would have broken less disciplined forces. This was their quiet pride. Not written in chronicles, not celebrated in songs, but known among themselves, they had survived the winter night, and they would do it again as many times as necessary until the campaign ended or until they did not wake.